My guest today is Dr. Eben Alexander. He was an academic neurosurgeon for over 25 years. He's also a New York Times best-selling author of the book Map of Heaven, Proof of Heaven, and Living in a Mindful Universe. Dr. Alexander, thank you for joining me and welcome.
Well, Rich, it's great to be here today. Thanks for having me on.
Awesome. Now, your story is all over the internet. You can touch on that if you want, but I would kind of like to lead into really talking about where we are collectively in regards to our knowledge of the relationship between brain and consciousness.
Okay, well, that sounds good. So basically, I can give you the brief kind of summary of my story and why I think it is of such importance to the scientific community. And then we can launch into everything from that point on, if that works for you.
Yes, that's great.
Okay, well, to begin with, I had honed the first 54 years of my life on a fairly conventional scientific worldview. I was associate professor of neurosurgery at Harvard Medical School. Thought I had some idea of how brain, mind, and consciousness work, and I subscribe to the conventional model that the physical world is all that exists and that the brain creates consciousness out of physical matter. And of course, that's what so many people believe. That's what a lot of scientists believe. And yet, in many ways, that model has been disproven with the advent of quantum physics and all these empirical human experiences like near-death experiences, et cetera, over the last few centuries and especially decades. Now, that was my worldview, but it was about to be completely discarded and thrown out because it doesn't fit my experience one tiny bit. November the 8th, November the 10th of 2008, I woke at 4:30 in the morning with severe back pain, soon realized I had a horrific headache. Within the hour or so, I was having grand mal seizures, and my family was very concerned and called the ambulance to the house. They hauled me off, still seizing and in deep coma from my home. There's a myth out in the lay media that somehow this was a medication-induced coma, which completely misses the power of the whole story. And that power resides in the fact that the evidence of damage to my brain, all lobes of my brain having full thickness damage was crystal clear from my neurologic exams, from my CT and MRI scans, et cetera. And all that was confirmed not just in my book, Proof of Heaven, with the medical details that I gave, but also in a medical case report that was written by 3 doctors not involved in my care, but absolutely astonished by my miraculous recovery. And they wrote this case report after reviewing more than 600 pages of my medical records. And in fact, there are 2 main conclusions in that peer-reviewed case report. One was that my brain was far too damaged based on the objective data to have come up with any kind of dream or hallucination, much less the most profound, extraordinary, detailed, memorable, and life-transforming set of events, which is exactly what happened. The second thing is to explain the way I am today. People who spend a week in coma due to a gram-negative bacterial meningoencephalitis do not end up having a full recovery. My case is really unprecedented in the medical literature. And that, I think, is the important statement for right now, that you have to explain my recovery somehow. And in fact, the peer reviewers challenged the authors and said, how do you explain this? And they said it's because he had a near-death experience that he was allowed this profound recovery. Now, to get right to the crux of what I experienced deep in that coma that I should not have experienced according to all the tenets of modern neuroscience, given the damage to my neocortex. Important to point out that, for one thing, I was amnesic, and that's an unusual feature of my near-death experience, or NDE. Most people who have NDEs have a fair amount of memory associated that allows them to engage in that spiritual realm. But for reasons that became clear to me in the months and years after my coma, I was amnesic. And that has to do with the fact that if I had had the very typical NDE, if my father, for example, had been there, he passed over 4 years before my coma, if he had been there, I would have been more tempted to dismiss the whole thing as, a trick of the dying brain. And that's why it had to take on these extraordinary characteristics, including the amnesia. I had to witness a complete loss of all memories and then a complete return of all memories in the 2 months after I came back from coma. But in the depths of the coma, in this amnesic state, it began in what I call the earthworm's eye view, a very primitive, coarse, unresponsive realm. And it seemed to go for ages and ages, because I had no memory moment to moment. And note, do remember at this point, I had no memory of humans, Earth, this universe, Eben Alexander's life events. None of that was there. None of my religious beliefs, none of my scientific knowledge. Every bit of it was deleted. And I think that was very important for me to have a empty slate to go through this extraordinary experience and then have a return of everything over the 2 months post-coma. Now, from that early earthworm eye view, as I called it, the primitive course, kind of dirty jello subterranean existence that it started in, I was rescued by a slowly spinning white light that approached me out of those murky mists in the earthworm eye view, and it opened up like a rip in the fabric of that ugly um, region and led up into this brilliant, ultra real, uh, ultra detailed gateway valley, as I call it. I was a speck of awareness on a butterfly wing. There were millions of other butterflies looping and spiraling in these vast formations. Um, and the scene was indescribably beautiful. That's one of the things you often hear these experiences are ineffable, that is, indescribable, that our language really doesn't suffice to try and explain them fully. And that's absolutely true. But I tried to give it the best shot I could in the description I gave in the book Proof of Heaven. But it was an absolutely lovely, idyllic environment, kind of like Plato's world of ideals, but for the individual soul, because that Gateway Valley uh, is an intersection of kind of the earthly realms and the higher spiritual realms, in which we would go through things like reuniting with souls of departed loved ones, with our higher soul, um, going through life reviews, planning next incarnations, all those rich kind of pieces of the spiritual realm that we often encounter would occur in that realm. And I remember I wasn't alone. That was one of the most beautiful aspects of this. And those who've read Proof of Heaven will realize there was a beautiful spiritual guide or guardian angel beside me on the butterfly wing, sparkling blue eyes, high cheekbones, high forehead. She never said a word to me. She never had to, but her message to me was deeply delivered mentally, telepathically, emotionally. You are deeply loved and cherished forever. You have nothing to fear. You are deeply cared for. And I cannot tell you how reassuring and affirming and comforting that message was. I was already getting the feeling in this realm that this is a spiritual home. This is not something that seems foreign to us. And that's one of the most amazing things about these journeys. Important to point out because they might sound scary or foreign, but in fact, what we find is we are most at home in that realm. And that is, to me, was just a real shocker. The comfort, the kind of acceptance, the engagement. And what I witnessed there was this soft summer breeze that blew through. And that summer breeze, which I called in my later writings many weeks later when I wrote it all up, the breath of God or divine wind, was really my first awareness in this amnesic state of the incredible power, connection, and love of that God force at the core of the universe that so many near-death experiencers have encountered. That's why they come back to this world and realize there's nothing to fear about death. It's a transition, but it is not the end of conscious awareness, as so many materialists falsely believe. And so what would happen was at that point, I remember all of the kind of lowest four-dimensional space-time material realm, all of that collapsing down. And all of this kind of rich spiritual realm, a realm that where you're already outside of our normal Earth time. That's why life reviews, which are not just remembering of events of a life, but a reliving of those events. And not only that, but a reliving of those events from the emotional perspective of those around us affected by our actions and thoughts. So the life review is a big, complex kind of reviewing of life where we experience, how we impacted other people. So if we are busy handing out pain and suffering to others, we feel all that in the life review, and it's not good to feel that. And that's why we are gently nudged through progressive life reviews towards treating each other more kindly and compassionately, because that is the deepest lesson, really, from all NDEs. It's kind of like the golden rule: treat others as you would like to be treated, is written into the very fabric of the universe through these life reviews, where the boundaries of self dissolve so that we can fully experience the emotional impact of our actions on others. And also that, as I said, that reliving, not just a remembering. So it's showing us we're completely outside of the linear narrative of causal reasoning that we usually think of in these material bodies. But from that perspective, all of it can happen at once. And then there are different levels of time, what I call meta time or deep time, that allow for that transformation, evolution of consciousness, reincarnation, for example, fully supporting our souls being there for loved ones when it's time, etc. So, in other words, people's concerns about reincarnation, will my loved one reincarnate before I get there? Well, no, that cannot happen given this concept of deep time and the way that the relationships and the love is the most important thing. Um, at any rate, those angelic choirs that were fueling all the beauty and festivities that I witnessed in this Gateway Valley, the lush plant life, the incredible, all the souls dancing in this joy and merriment, angelic choirs, swooping orbs of light up above that were fueling all of this. That served as yet another musical portal. Interesting that all these kind of abilities of my soul to traverse these realms had to do with music, remembering musical notes and melodies, frequencies, things like that. Um, Very important concept. Of course, sounds there are far beyond anything that we would ever be able to hear with our ears in the four-dimensional space-time in which we reside. So that sound is really something that cannot be duplicated here. That kind of music is really extraordinary. Those angelic choirs and the melodies that I associated with that initial portal up from the earthworm eye view into the Gateway Valley. But at any rate, to cut this short so that we can move on to your questions, this was not the end of my journey. It turns out that those angelic choirs provided yet another portal. And that's when I saw all of that meta time, that spiritual realm called causal chain collapsing down as I ascended into this infinite inky blackness that I call the core. It was actually the home of the divine, the sanctum sanctorum of that infinitely loving God force. And by the time you're there, there is no remaining ego sense whatsoever. In fact, everything has blended into all paradoxes, resolved, all dualities becoming one. That's why that God force is just pure, unconditional love with an infinite power to heal and bring into wholeness. And that's an important concept in terms of the deeper mission of coming into wholeness and healing for all of our civilization in the current era through a deeper understanding of this relationship with that one mind. So in any way, in that core realm, as I called it, that third level, the most kind of distant from this four-dimensional space-time, oneness with the divine is something I experienced purely. And it showed me that divine force of God, that infinite force of love that is so commonly encountered in that realm, is the very source of our conscious awareness. We're never separate from it at all. And that's the part that we need to reawaken to, in this whole journey of understanding. Now, it turns out that I would tumble back down from that core realm into the earthworm's eye view, and it was by remembering the musical notes of the melody that I could conjure up that portal and rise back up into the Gateway Valley, always welcomed by that beautiful, loving guardian angel, always witnessing a lot of the same kind of events. Some of the lessons occurred there. Many of the lessons occurred in the core. But all of it contributed to my deeper understanding of the oneness of mind, the fact that the brain is a filter that acts as a reducing valve, but for a primordial unified consciousness. And that's where this world is waking up to a much deeper truth. And So I cycled through these many a time, but then there came a point where, just as they promised me, every time I passed through the core, you're not here to stay, you'll be going back. And there came a point where I was trying to conjure up, using the musical notes of the melody, to go back up into that Gateway Valley from another fall down into the Earthworm's Eye View, and it didn't work. They had told me I wasn't there to stay, that I'd be going back, and now I knew that was serious. I was going back. But I also had learned by this point that I could trust, that I would be taken care of, that infinitely loving force was going to usher me wherever I needed to be. And that's where I saw thousands of beings going around me off in the distance, heads bowed, arms like this, many holding candles. And that murmuring energy coming from all these beings was welcoming me in the same lovely spiritual home sense as I'd first encountered in passing up into the Gateway Valley in the core. So it was surprising to me that now with this murmuring energy, I could get the same thing. And that energy I called in when I returned here, or weeks later, writing it all up, I said that was the power of prayer. That's what I was feeling and witnessing. That's what's kind of ushering me back to this realm. And that's when I also saw six faces that would bubble up out of the muck. They'd say a few words that I couldn't understand, then disappear. I remember those faces as vividly today as if the whole thing happened this morning. They were an essential part of that spiritual journey. And they serve a purpose because five of them were physically present in the ICU room the last 24 hours of my coma. So, in fact, they were what are called veridical time anchors that proved to me that the vast majority of my coma experience, that seemed to go for months or years, must have happened between days 1 and 4, or at most 1 and 5 of my 7-day coma, 7-day Earth time coma. All that timing is explained in the book. But it was really the sixth face of those that got my attention and demanded something. And that was the face of a 10-year-old boy. And of course, this was the last face I saw. It turns out it was the face of my 10-year-old son, Bond. Even though I did not recognize him, my amnesia was still in full power. But it was Sunday morning, day 7 of coma. The doctors said I'd gone from a 10% to a 2% chance of survival, and now with no chance of recovery. And that's why they recommended stopping the antibiotics, letting nature take its course. And that's when Bond heard that news. They'd protected him from the worst news during the week, but he heard this, and all of a sudden, oh my God, he came running down the hallway into my ICU bed, where I was lying there on my ventilator with my eyes taped shut. He pulled open my eyelids, one eye looking over here, one over there, neither pupil responding. Those of you in medicine know that's a horrible scene. And I promise you, I did not hear him with my ears, see him with my eyes. I was far too gone from my physical body. But his message got through to me. He was pleading with me, Dad, you're going to be okay. Dad, you're going to be okay. As if somehow that would make it so. And across the eons of spiritual realm, distances, that message came through to me. And I realized for the first time in this journey that it all mattered. Up until that time, I thought, well, this can continue, it can cease, it doesn't matter. But now I realized there was another soul that needed me. And oh my gosh, I had to somehow come back. And my spiritual will was enough to drive me back to this world. Again, I cannot explain how that all works, but I can tell you that my will in that moment was enough to drive me back to this world. And when I woke up in that ICU room, my amnesia was still intact. So I did not even recognize my mother, my sons, my sisters standing at the bedside. I had no idea who these beings were. But language and memories, personal memories started coming back very quickly over hours and a day or two. Um, and in fact, a lot of it returned over the next week, to where I was fully recognizing everyone and all of that. And yet I was mystified by the incredible power of this experience. And I tried to tell it to my doctors, and they would say, well, the dying brain plays all kinds of tricks. Your brain was soaking in pus. We don't even understand how you're coming back to us now. But you can forget about it because the dying brain plays all kinds of tricks. So I took them at their word, and this was before my neuroscience knowledge was back. This was before I knew the medical details of my own case, which I only uncovered over the next few weeks and months by going back over my medical records, scans, talking it all over with my doctors, trying to figure out what happened. And in the meantime, my doctors were inviting me to things like my own morbidity mortality conference, which is very rare for someone who almost dies to get to go there. And because they were interested, how did you come back? You know, the whole medical center was interested. And in fact, the County Medical Society had me give a dinner talk on my experience a few months later. Because they wanted to know, and more than 100 of my fellow physicians and their spouses attended this dinner talk where I tried to explain, what it was like for me and how I thought I'd come back. But it's been 14 years of work since that time, working with scientists around the world, coming up with a much deeper understanding of my experience and how it could work, working with other near-death experiences around the world, and a lot of research scientists around the world who study these things. So it's been an extraordinary 14 years since my coma trying to make sense of it. But the good news is we are actually making tremendous progress. And that's what the follow-up books, The Map of Heaven, and especially the third book, Living in a Mindful Universe, that was co-written with my life partner, Karen Newell. That's the book that really goes the distance to show how science and spirituality are coming together. And in fact, in another decade or so, no one will doubt the reality of all of this, because that's the reality of human experience. And for scientists in the past to say, well, we don't understand it, so it can't be true, is complete nonsense. If we don't understand it, that doesn't negate the reality of these experiences. But it turns out that the spiritual realms can be well explained in a scientific fashion in the current era. You have to resort to quantum physics. You have to resort to the hard problem of consciousness, to philosophy of mind, to consilience of all these lines of evidence that point to the primacy of consciousness of the universe. But that's exactly the goal of our book, Living in a Mindful Universe. And that's been endorsed by many of the world's leading scientists of consciousness studies around the world today, because it goes a long way towards explaining how all this is absolutely the scientific reality of our current era.
Yeah, that's you kind of touched on a couple of the things that I was going to ask you, because one of the first things I was going to ask is where you feel like we are in regards to understanding the relationship between brain and consciousness. Because obviously, me, like pretty much everybody else probably who knows who you are, I first heard your story back in 2017, and my first thought was, this guy is probably one of the most important key players in this movement of shifting into like a new world, a new understanding. So do you think we're making really good progress as far as that goes?
We are absolutely making progress. I have no question about that. In fact, I have absolute proof of that progress. Your listeners can go to bigelowinstitute.org and learn a lot more about this. Last year, in 2021, Robert Bigelow, who's an aerospace engineer in Las Vegas, of all places, ran a contest. And in this contest, he challenged people. What is the best scientific evidence for the continuation of conscious awareness after permanent bodily death? That was a question. They received more than 1,000 applications, people who wanted to participate and get this, $2 million almost in prize money. And then they demanded that you had to demonstrate at least 5 years of scientific research experience in the afterlife question to even participate. And with that stipulation, they ended up receiving 204 essays. Some of them were written by multiple people. And those essays, they originally were going to give out 3 prizes. But the essays were of such high quality that they ended up giving out 29 prizes, monetary awards. And those papers, those essays, are available to the reading public for free right now. Go to bigelowinstitute.org and start reading. Once you start reading these essays, you'll realize it's no longer a question of, is this science or spirituality? What's going on here? This is all scientifically based. And it's a very strong argument for the reality of the primacy of soul. And the reality of these experiences is really undeniable. So in future discussions, if you have a materialist scientist who says this is all nonsense, you just have to ask him, well, you obviously have not read any of the Bigelow essays, so you need to start doing your homework. so we can start getting some common ground, share our facts, and then we can discuss how it all works. But to pretend that it's impossible because materialist science doesn't allow it is ridiculous. These experiences happen every day and have happened to millions of people. So BigelowInstitute.org is an excellent resource to get into it. Jeffrey Mishlov's first place essay is a game changer in itself, but the rest of those 28 essays are extremely good. And they come at it from many different angles. And if you count yourself as such a hardcore, rigorous scientist that all you want is the hardcore, rigorous scientific data, I would urge you to go to Pim Van Lommel's paper, or he won second place, or go to Bernardo Kastrup's paper. He doesn't resort to any kind of paranormal experience at all to make a perfectly beautiful case for objective idealism or analytic idealism and the reality of the primacy of mind. So the scientific world is waking up to the reality of these experiences and will no longer, never again, deny them or debunk them because that just shows willful ignorance on behalf of the scientist. They're just demonstrating that they haven't read any of these Bigelow essays or any of the other literature supporting the reality of the afterlife. So yes, this world is changing dramatically. And in fact, what I will tell you is that just this week, the 10th anniversary edition of Proof of Heaven has come out because it was 10 years ago yesterday that that book was first published. And this week, the 10th anniversary edition is out. That edition has a new prologue that I wrote that explains how far we have come over these 10 years and talks not just about the Bigelow essay contest, but also about there was a neuroscientist in Belgium when we were presenting there in 2018 who made the point that the number of scientific papers, if you do a PubMed search on scientific papers on near-death experiences, you'll find that that number quadrupled, the annual rate quadrupled in 2013 and beyond, which they stipulated was due to the publication of the book Proof of Heaven, that they saw as a catalyst that tremendously shifted the scientific community on this question and resulted in this huge uptick in the number of scientific papers on near-death experiences. Now, I don't know if Proof of Heaven's publication in 2012 did that. Maybe I was just very fortunate to publish at such an opportune time. But there's no question that it's been very much supported, and especially the third book, Living in a Mindful Universe, endorsed by people like Ed Kelly, Bernardo Kastrup, Bruce Grayson, Jim Tucker, Stan Krippner, Dean Radin. I mean, the list goes on and on. Larry Dossey, the number of scientists who study consciousness, who've endorsed Living in a Mindful Universe, is tremendous because of the fact we are making progress. And those who read Living in a Mindful Universe will definitely see the direction in which we're headed.
Good, good. There's something else that you're into that I'm also very fascinated with, and that is the brainwave entrainment.
Yes.
Can we touch on that a
absolutely.
little bit, the sacred acoustics?
Yes, well, it turns out that I use binaural beat brainwave entrainment, an hour or two a day. I've been doing that for 11, 12 years now. And that is a form of deep meditation. And I was first introduced to it within about 2 years of my coma, when I had read 150 books on quantum physics, consciousness, et cetera, trying to figure it all out. And I knew finally that what I really had to do was explore my own consciousness and start meditating. And that's when I learned of the work of Robert Monroe at Monroe Institute and his binaural beat brainwave entrainment. For your audience, just to inform them a little better of the bigger picture, binaural beats, a phenomenon discovered in the mid 1800s by a Prussian physicist. He demonstrated with a single tone, a pure tone to one ear, and a slightly different tone can be different by anywhere from 0.1 to 25 hertz or so, cycles per second. But the different tone in the other ear, and what it does is it generates this wavering sound deep in somewhere in the brain, kind of a wah, 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 wavering sound that's equal to the arithmetic difference between those two input tones. So if we put in 104 hertz here, 100 hertz here, we'll get a 4 hertz wavering tone as the differential between them. And then investigators in the 20th century, Robert Monroe being one of them, but other investigators too, found that you could enhance out-of-body experiences using binaural beat brainwave entrainment. Other investigators found you could enhance remote viewing skills. Remote viewing is, that the whole field of psychic spies, and I like how remote viewing has been used in other ways than just military intelligence. For example, Stefan Schwartz has written extensively about how he used remote viewers in archaeological digs in the Middle East and on Malta, places like that, to discern what was going on underground. Remote viewing is a way of putting your mind into a state where you can actually receive information from the universe. Another example is back in 1973, Ingo Swann remote viewed the blue rings of Jupiter 6 years before the Voyager spacecraft went by and documented the blue rings of Jupiter. And so it was remote viewed long before that. So remote viewing is a way to access information across space and time that is a very powerful technique that's been statistically validated by Jessica Utz, head of the American Statistical Association, et cetera. This stuff is very powerful. But when you can enhance it using binaural beat brainwave entrainment, that's what we're talking about right now. And I use it for meditation. And we've shared binaural beat brainwave entrainment in the form of sacred acoustics. You can learn more at sacredacoustics.com. Full disclosure, that is the website of my partner, Karen Newell, the co-author of Living in a Mindful Universe. I'm their alpha user. I don't have particular financial interest in sacred acoustics, but I am a big fan and use it all the time because I've found it to be of incredibly good value in developing my relationships with everything I did in my near-death experience. And the way Karen and I have used it in workshops is to help people who've never had a near-death experience use something like sacred acoustics, binaural beat brainwave entrainment to get into a deep conscious state where they can interact with this primordial mind, with higher souls, connect with souls of departed loved ones. All the big, powerful stuff you can do in meditation when you learn how to go deep and leave your little ego voice far behind. So sacred acoustics for me is a real game changer. And we have used it very specifically with the NDE scale developed by Bruce Grayson in 1983 to help people who've never had a near-death experience start to cultivate the various transcendental features and paranormal features of NDEs that help them to connect in ways that NDEs would help them connect. And this is where I think this kind of meditative experience can be most valuable to people.
That's awesome. I had a question. You kind of touched on it a little bit. On you hear some near-death experiencers try to explain the other side, and one thing that almost everybody says is that time on the other side doesn't happen like it happens here.
Right.
And it's very, very difficult for people to explain it. How would you explain the relationship between time here in this realm and time over there?
Well, I would start by saying time in this realm is very simple. It simply supports an unfolding drama. Okay, so it allows us to have a flowing narrative, living these lives. Now, of course, we take breaks from our sense of time every night when we go to sleep, go into dream world. And I think there's some deep and profound reasons for that. I don't claim to understand them yet, but they have a lot to do with consciousness and how it interacts with the brain and all of that. But ultimately, I think time flow in this material world only serves this tiny little narrative. And so when you're elevated up and out of that, through meditation, through an NDE, what have you, hypnotic regression can do this. But meditation is a very powerful way to get up and out of this kind of sense of flow of earth time. That's when you can start to visualize from the perspective of what I call meta time or deep time. And that's why, that's the whole reason that the life review, which is described in anywhere from 25 to 50% of near-death experiences, depending on the series, but the life review is really a reliving of events. It is not a remembering, a vague sepia-tinted remembering of events. It's a reliving of events in a very detailed, engaging fashion to allow you to grow from the events. And of course, as we all have heard many a time, as indie ears proclaim, is your whole life can flash before your eyes in great detail, and it can happen like that, in the snap of a finger, for example, during a cardiac arrest. So you don't need huge swathes of earth time to experience this meta time because you're already completely up and out of our earthly time flow. And it's a very important concept to get. And again, as I said earlier, so many times when you talk about all this stuff, and especially the huge scientific data supporting the reality of reincarnation, which is a giant piece of this whole discussion, just understand that the relationships and love, the binding force of love, are the most important factors. So there's no way a loved one would reincarnate before they would be there available to you in your passing over. And metatime is what allows for that kind of paradox to be avoided. So, very important because so many people, when they learn of the scientific evidence fully supporting reincarnation, they start to worry. Well, what if my loved one reincarnates before I get there? And I'm just telling you, based on the structure of deep time, metatime, and kind of soul journeys and the binding force of love, that would never happen.
One of the things that, one of my favorite things that I would hear you talk about when I very first started listening to your story was that most people who do believe in the conventional scientific model that the brain creates consciousness, they don't have the first sentence to explain how that would happen. Now, we're starting to come to an understanding that the brain is a filter that allows consciousness in. Are we developing the first sentence that explains how that happens?
Well, I think the important thing to remember, now I'm not saying that neurons create consciousness, but neurons are definitely involved with consciousness, okay? Neurons, each of us has between 85 and 100 billion neurons in our brain, many of which participate in this conscious process. And as I keep telling you, it's a filtering mechanism. So, in other words, its primordial unified consciousness is somehow working through the brain to give us this kind of perceptual awareness of the physical realm. And that's where I think the power lies. And the thing to remember in this discussion is that each and every one of those neurons is absolutely, completely, 100% a quantum computer. They all work with ions confined tightly in ion channels so that, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, which basically tells you that you can never know with full accuracy both the momentum and position of a subatomic particle at a given time. And the interesting thing is that this whole kind of process of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, given the tight confinement of ions and ion channels and neurotransmitters and synaptic vesicles and other um, features of microtubules which can maintain quantum states. There's something about that whole system that is enabling conscious awareness in this primordial mind to project down into our brain by basically allowing only certain of those quantum states to exist. And that's what allows a certain kind of subjective reality to come into our awareness. But I think we're at a point where we really have to kind of flip our understanding of all this and not keep looking at the material realm as if that's going to give us the causal chain of events that lead to reality. But instead, we need to really flip this whole thing. And the problem that conventional science gets into is thinking that all of emergent reality is the result of bottom-up causation from the subatomic realm. That is, that if you understand the electrons, protons, quarks, photons, all the laws that govern them, physics, chemistry, biology, put all that together, and this whole kind of sea of subatomic particles, atoms, and molecules will spontaneously give you this reality emergent. And what that is completely missing is that human beings have never experienced a direct fundamental physical reality. All they've experienced is a phenomenal awareness. We've never experienced a direct physical reality. We see the reds and greens and blues that are coded in our nervous system for a teeny tiny piece of the electromagnetic spectrum, as one example. Okay, so all the information going on around us, I've heard the comparison that if you were to compare the visible spectrum, that is the light we can see with our eyes, to the entire electromagnetic spectrum, it'd be like looking at the paint on the surface of the 102nd floor of the Empire State Building. That's the thickness of the paint there correlates with visible light. And all the rest of the Empire State Building is everything else of all the radio waves, the deeper long frequency waves, infrared, ultraviolet, X-rays, gamma, etc. All of that incredible amount of information that we don't even experience at all. And not only that, I mean, when you get down to it psychologically, we realize that what you see with your eyes, most of that is filled in by the brain. The visual information only serves as a clue, whereas most of your visual field is actually stuff that is put in by your brain as an interpretation of information. But to pretend that we have access to some ultimate stream of information, excuse me, that equals some fundamental physical reality is just not true. And in fact, the deepest lesson of quantum physics is that none of this exists other than through the mind of the observer. Idealism, objective idealism. Excuse me one second, I've got to clear a cough.
You're okay.
Sorry.
No, you're fine.
Okay, so
Another thing that I was wanting to touch on is that one of the things that I've heard you mention is that memories are not stored in the brain either. So I'm wondering why it may be that some people recall their NDE and some people don't. Do you think maybe the person who recalls it, it was planned pre-birth to have that NDE and remember it for a reason? Or why do you think that would be?
well, that's that's a very good question. And I'm not sure I have an answer. What I can tell you is that neurosurgeons have suspected for decades that memories are not stored in the brain. The main reason is we've never had any report of a case where a given brain resection corresponded to a given loss of long-term memories. Now, it's been known since the early 1950s that if you operate on the medial temporal lobes, hippocampus, and certain parts of the limbic system, that you can destroy our ability to convert short-term to long-term memory. But that's not the same thing at all as claiming to have found where long-term memories are stored in the brain, because in fact, there doesn't seem to be a place. I know Wilder Penfield, one of the most renowned neurosurgeons in the 20th century, he was Canadian, worked in Montreal. He did a lot of awake craniotomies in people for epilepsy, where he would stimulate the brain and then note what the phenomenal experience was associated with that electrical stimulation. And that's how he tailored his resection. Now, I've done hundreds of those awake craniotomies myself, so I know all about the pitfalls, the ways they're used, and how best to protect speech and motor systems by using those techniques. But I defer to Penfield because he really was studying memory very directly. And he came through writing a book in 1975 towards the end of his career called The Mystery of the Mind. And he, excuse me, he made it very clear in that book that memories were not stored in the cortex. I'm, excuse me, I'm very sorry for this
You're fine.
cough, but I'll be right back. I'm
You're
going to do a
okay.
better job of clearing it. Very sorry, but
Oh,
I
you're
think
fine.
I'm better.
I'll just edit that out. It's okay.
Okay. And so but I was talking about Wilder Penfield, and he made it very clear that memory is not stored in the neocortex, which is where most neurosurgeons even today would think memories are stored. He was thinking maybe somewhere in the brainstem, but really the brainstem does not have the kind of complexity to really store memories in that fashion. And then, of course, there's also that huge body of evidence in the scientific world on reincarnation. If you go to uvadops.org, that's the University of Virginia Division of Perceptual Studies, you'll find they've studied more than 2,700 cases of past life memories in children suggestive of reincarnation over the last 6 decades. And 1,700 of those cases are, quote, solved. That means that they actually found the prior person whose life is described by the child. And so reincarnation, when you study that literature, is an absolute fact of human existence. The thing is, most of us don't remember our past lives, certainly as adults. And as Ian Stevenson and Jim Tucker, the two scientists who have spent the most time building up that database over 6 decades, will admit, if you want to recover these memories from children, you have to recover them before age 6 or 7 because they're natural processes that cover over our memories of past life and between lives. So that as adults, the vast majority of us don't remember them unless those memories are reawakened. For example, in a near death experience, a shared death experience, they can be reawakened in hypnotic regression, in meditation, many different ways they can come back to the fore. But this world needs to wake up to this big, profound fact that our souls come back again and again, especially in the light of near-death experiences, where we realize that it matters how we treat each other. Um, and so not only do we come back, but we really need to lean much more towards treating each other with kindness, love, respect, acceptance, mercy, when necessary, forgiveness. But it really is imperative for this world to grow up to this deeper lesson, as exemplified by those Bigelow Institute essays, by Living in a Mindful Universe and similar books that are pointing to this emerging scientific reality.
Yeah, one of the things that I've heard a lot of people say, and if I remember correctly, I think I've heard you touch on this too. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that it's very intentional that we're supposed to forget about all that in order to come like play this part. Would you say that's true?
Well, I would say it seems to be very much the case now. That is, when I look at all this, I think the rules change over time. But I'd say the rules in this 5,000-year epoch in which we are currently living, the rules are that we're to learn more about the oneness of mind, that we're all, divine, sacred, connected to that God force. And that's what humanity is to learn from this experience. Beyond that point, off into the future, I have no idea what the deep and profound lessons, what the direction of evolution of consciousness will be. But in many ways, I like to say that the current uh, goal of humanity really is to pursue what Pierre Teilhard de Chardin recognized as our true evolution back in the mid 20th century when he wrote his book, The Phenomenon of Man. And in that book, he realized at that time there were big debates about evolution and Darwinian evolution and biological systems. And he realized there was a much richer evolution going on, not just of biological systems on Earth, but of consciousness throughout the cosmos. And that, I believe, is exactly what is truly happening. We are here, there are uncountable other civilizations, but we are not really part of that club yet. And that's because so far we continue to live like a very barbaric caveman species with active warfare, violence and conflict, this kind of ridiculous political polarization, and all the conflict in our world is from that false sense of separation that's inherent in materialist thought. And the sooner we can realize that a more quantum informed, unified, primordial consciousness view of reality is a much better way of coming into understanding all this, And realizing that we need to grow into that. But I think you're right. I think that this is what I call programmed forgetting. That we come into these lives, our souls have been here before, but as a young child, we remember those connections. They can, in those past life memory cases, you can find that children's lives are often affected. They can have phobias, they can have behaviors, they can even have birthmarks that are uh, the result of the wound of the mortal injury of the prior lifetime. So all of these things show us very profoundly kind of the connection that we share with these prior lifetime. And in the whole world of transpersonal psychology, which originated with the work of Carl Jung, the famous Swiss psychoanalyst, perpetuated by people like Stan Grof, who did all his work with holotropic breath work, Brian Weiss, Michael Newton, and other investigators, all of them have carried forth as transpersonal psychology the idea that to really make sense of the issues in our psyche in this lifetime, we have to reflect on the fact that we've been here before. Our psyche has built up a history in the past. That a history, anything that we didn't deal with effectively in those lifetimes gets reshuffled into this lifetime. That's why, it's best to try and really live consciously in this lifetime and get as much of the work done as you can growing as a soul so that you won't have the same kind of challenges packaged into your next lifetime. That's another argument why suicide is not a correct response to living in this lifetime, because the issues you're dodging with a suicide only become repackaged for the next life. You still have to get through them. So the sooner we awaken to this richer kind of sense of self and acknowledge that the rule here is really how much love, compassion, kindness, acceptance, and mercy we can show to all of our fellow beings. And the sooner we start doing that in this lifetime, the more facile we will be when we leave this physical body in meeting up with our higher souls and soul groups and planning next incarnations to really make progress into the next lifetime, as opposed to just coming back and facing the same bunch of issues that we were supposed to grow from in this lifetime.
Great. Well, before we wrap this up, would you have one last positive message for the viewers?
I think the most important thing is the world is changing. This transition I'm talking about, where the scientific community is using quantum physics, neuroscience, philosophy of mind, parapsychology, all the consilience of information from those fields that screams at us that we're sharing one mind, that we're all in this together. That will change the world, and it'll change the world for the better. No soul left behind, as Karen and I often say. Everyone is involved in this transformation. And you can start going within meditation, centering prayer, whatever. This is all about more of a unification of religions. Because there's a beautiful book I love by a friend, Christopher Copps. It's called The Essence of Religions. In that book, he uses near-death experiences as the gold standard for what religions have been trying to teach us all along about what happens when we die, the healing force of love, et cetera, et cetera. And I highly recommend that book because it really goes a long way towards helping to understand how no religion gets it perfectly, but to the extent that any religion can promote true universal love, kindness, compassion, all inclusive for all of our fellow beings and not be exclusive and not be ideological in a way that foments, separation and conflict. That's really what is ultimately happening here. And I include in the religions of the world materialist science. It is a faith-based religion that actually has less to support it than many faith-based religions. A quantum-informed science of consciousness, however, goes a great distance towards proving this unification of consciousness that we all share, the fact that we're all in this together. And there you just take that lead from the near-death experience community, that binding force of love is what ultimately connects us all. So we should start living like that and choosing our lives to reflect the sacred divine nature of ourselves and of all our fellow beings and how we are connected. We're here to take care of each other. That includes taking care of the least, the last, and the lost. And it really is our responsibility as human beings to wake up to true wisdom by rejecting the false, bleak, and paltry fiction of materialism that pretends the brain creates consciousness and that you're nothing but your physical body, and accepts the reality that we're eternal souls living a forever life, and we're here to learn these deep lessons of oneness and connection and compassion for all.
Dr. Alexander, it's been an absolute honor to have you here on the show. I greatly appreciate you. I wish you the best, and you have a good day, okay?
Well, Rich, thanks so much for having me on. It's great talking with you, and I greatly appreciate your getting this out to the world. So thank you and blessings to you and all of your audience.
All right. Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye now.